and welcome to another edition of the Hopgood Hour, my monthly public affairs show that brings the people of the 8th District news and views from Lansing. As always, please feel free to contact my office with any questions or concerns that you may have regarding state government. You can give us a call, give us an email, or write us a letter, and we'll do our best to answer your concerns. I'm pleased today to have Ms. Ellen Jeffries, the director of the Senate Fiscal Agency, and she is going to talk about the budget. We're going to discuss the state budget on today's show, and we're in the middle of budget season, so this is definitely a timely topic. The state of Michigan has a $50 billion budget, and so welcome to today's show, Ms. Jeffries. Could you maybe just start off by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Certainly. Well, I've been around here a long time, probably about 37 years, all at the Senate Fiscal Agency. Started off as a fiscal analyst, and now I'm the director, and I've worked on various budgets, the regulatory area, higher ed budget, and now I kind of have just the higher level type of involvement with the budget, so I'm not as good on the details as I used to be, but I can certainly give highlights. And our office is nonpartisan, as you know, and so that's probably the most important thing to us, is that we serve both Republicans and Democrats in the Senate, and try to provide objective, unbiased fiscal information. So I guess that's what I would say. And we keep everything confidential also that senators ask us to do on their behalf.
So you work with the legislators as we're developing the budget?
Yes. We would actually provide the technical support. We would put the bills together, actually put the key in the numbers that once the subcommittees have made decisions. As you know, it starts off, the governor presented his budget in February 5th, and that's when the budget season kicks off. And so you're right now the House and Senate are both working on the budget at the same time, which is different than the process we used to have, where the bills were split up between the House and Senate. Now it's the Senate does a complete budget, the House does a complete budget, and then we cross them over, we pass them over. It'll be after the spring recess, there'll be the third week of April, I believe, the House and Senate appropriations committees will be taking up all the recommendations of the various subcommittees. And then once the subcommittees, or once the full committee makes decisions on each of the subcommittee recommendations, they of course will go to the House and Senate floors. Then the House and Senate will exchange those bills, and then there will be what we call CREC, but it's the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference, and it's established by law. And it requires the House Fiscal Agency, Senate Fiscal Agency, and the administration. And it can be either the state budget director or the state treasurer, whichever the governor would designate. We sit down and analyze the economic data and revenue data and come up with how much money do we have to spend in the end to put the final budget together. And we did that in January, so that the governor had those numbers to put together the executive budget, and we will then look at the numbers again. And some years it's a huge variation. We've had, as you know, during the time you've been here, we've had billion-dollar deficits come up during the year, which makes it very difficult to put together a final budget. The last couple years haven't been quite as huge a shift, and right now I was talking to our economist just earlier today, and revenues are down a little bit right now compared to our estimate, but he still thinks we're on track to finish at about where the consensus was in January. That may change when we get to May. Sales tax revenue's down a bit, and his theory is that the weather is part of that people are just don't want to go out and buy anything because it's been the weather has been so bad. But I guess what that might mean is that revenues may not change much in May, so that we wouldn't have a lot of extra money. We may not have a lot less money either, but that you would be basically working with the same dollar amounts that were in the governor's original budget. So and once the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference comes to an agreement, and it's been going on now for 20 years, over 20 years, and there's never not been a consensus among the three groups. once those numbers are there and we know how much total money we can spend, then the legislative leaders meet to take that total amount of money and decide how much each budget area should get. And then once they decide that, targets are given to each of the subcommittee members, and there are conference committees then that will start to meet, and the conference committees would be members of House and Senate that would sit down and try to work out, given the dollar target they have for their budget. And we would say the target generally means doesn't include federal money or fee revenue, that type of thing. It's usually what we call general fund, general purpose, the more discretionary part of the state revenue. That's where the target is set, and then you start to work with your colleagues to try to come to an agreement on, say, the Department of Education or the K-12 budget.
The end of the process would be a consensus revenue estimating conference in May, when the correct what you discussed, and then the legislative leaders coming to an agreement on the final budget targets, and then those being put into the different bills for the different departments and different agencies, and then the legislature passing those bills and sending them to the governor. Is that correct?
Yes, that would be correct. And as you also know, there's been it's been kind of accelerated on an accelerated schedule the last couple years. And in years prior, we were still working on the budget in September, maybe even October, but those were the years when the revenue was dropping, and so it was much more difficult to put together budgets in those years. When you have stable revenue or increasing revenue, which we've had the last couple of years, it's much easier to get the budget done in a timely manner.
So maybe now we're in this accelerated time frame, but back then we had time frames which, we would start going through the budget, and then things would kind of grind to a halt, and we'd be at an impasse for weeks and weeks at a time. Is that true? Yes,
that was very true. We would go through the whole summer without, people would be meeting over the summer and trying to come, but it would be basically an impasse because it's tough to make, when you have to make cuts of 500, 600, 700, up to $1 billion, obviously it's not easy to do because every group has every interest, every senator and House member has their constituencies that they try to serve.
So one of the features of that time frame was also divided government, correct? So you had different parties controlling different pieces of the budget making process. You had a big sort of budget deficit, if you will, and lots of cuts that occurred in the first year of the current governor administration. Yes. And yet they were able to fulfill that budget timeline in that accelerated time frame. Yes. So we did a lot of cuts, and we did it very quickly, I guess, or relative to those other years that you're talking about.
Yes, and I think you're right. It's when there's, the control, the power is shared, it's harder to negotiate probably.
So tell me the pros and cons, if you would, about the House and the Senate doing their budgets concurrently, or doing them half at a time and then half, after the other chamber has finished those budgets. Is there a quick couple of pros and cons that you can give me to that?
I would think there's probably a little more deliberation when you split the bills in half and originate them so that you're working on the Senate's working on half the budget at one time, and then you switch over to the other half. You also then have the opportunity to see what the other body does with those budgets, which now it's all happening at the same time. It does speed up the process, so I guess that's a pro for doing it all at once, but I think you do lose some of the deliberation that you would have if you split the bills, the way it used to be done. You have more time to examine it, and I think but it probably does take a little bit longer. And then the format of the bills, which is the Senate still does individual budget bills, and the House does what they call the omnibus budget bills. There are only two, and so they take all the education, the K-12, community colleges, and higher ed are in one education omnibus, and then all the other state departments and agencies are in the other general omnibus. And so that's a difference between the House and Senate as well. And it's, again, I suppose it's faster because on the House floor and on the Senate floor, for that matter, you take a vote on only 2 bills. Whereas the Senate, as the Senate continues to do, there are, I think, at least probably 12 or 13 or 15 separate bills that we vote on in the Senate. And so it's a different, that's different. And I guess, again, it's deliberation. There's a little more deliberation, I think, when you do that, because you can focus more on the individual departments as opposed to the whole omnibus. You have to.
As someone who has been around for a little bit and seen the different processes, can you speak to, I guess, the either the centralization or the decentralization of some of the budget making decisions under these different factors, whether or not you're doing budgets concurrently, whether or not you're rolling up all the bills into these really big budget bills, does it matter or not?
Well, probably from a strictly technical point of view, I'm not sure it does or not, because you're taking these individual bills that the Senate does and basically sewing them up together and putting them in an omnibus bill. So the substance of them is still the same. So I don't, from that perspective, when we get to the end, you're voting on those bills, and I guess you can make a decision. But what's different about it is if there's an omnibus, and I think the federal government operates with omnibus budget bills, I'm not exactly sure, but you're kind of forced to vote then. You either like it all, or if there's one thing you don't like, you don't have the opportunity to vote against the state police budget, but vote for the community health budget if that would be something you'd want to do. In the Senate, you could do that because there's separate bills, but all of those departments are in one bill in the end, and so you kind of, so from that point of view, but the content of the individual bills is the same in the omnibus as it was in the individual bills, but you just don't have, so I'm not sure, it's probably not very substantive. It's probably more from something that I don't really get into the political side of it, but there could be advantages and disadvantages on that side of it for individual members. But from a technical point of view, it's definitely, you have, it's easier to find things in separate bills than it is in one giant bill. So
the political processes being different can lead to potentially different outcomes.
Yes, I think that's probably true.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So we talked sort of a little bit about the end of the budget process, but the beginning of the budget process you also mentioned is the January Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference, which gives us the numbers to look at, sort of starting to work on next year's budget, which then the governor presents in February. But it also gets us looking at the current year's budget, and are we sort of keeping that in balance? So there's been discussion about a budget surplus, perhaps. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that for a second?
Sure. And as you know, and as you just mentioned, we really work on like 3 budget years at the same time, because we finish. It's the budget that the books just closed on the 12-13 budget, and there was a larger ending balance than we had thought because revenues came in better there. And then when we're in the 13-14 budget is the year we're in right now, which, as you mentioned, we just passed in the Senate and the House last week a $200 and some million supplemental for the year that we're in right now, and then so that takes away from revenue that would be available in the fiscal year that you're working on, the 14-15 budget. So it all kind of flows down from that. So any money that you spend, if there's extra revenue in January at the consensus, if you spend that in the current fiscal year, you don't have it available to spend necessarily in the upcoming fiscal year. And so I think that's part of what in the supplemental that just passed, when the governor introduced his budget, it was balanced, and I think there was about a $41 million ending balance for the the 14-15 budget, which would have been the one he announced in February. But because we have spent extra money in the current year, that ending balance has pretty much gone away. So it's basically like at a zero balance, which means when we get into the final deliberations on the 15 budget, if there isn't any new revenue in May, it constrains people a little more. The governor basically spent, I wouldn't say spent the surplus, but he spent about $300 million more in 15 than he did in 14, in 15. He recommended various program changes. He recommended property tax relief, the homestead property tax credit, to change the income limits to your income, instead of being 50,000, could be 60, and the percentage of the credits that you measure, right now it's 3.5% of your property tax that you could get back. Now or the threshold would be that it's lowered to 3 in his proposal for 15. He also recommended.
So just going back, because there was a lot made of the surplus. There were newspaper headlines, and so just so there's a clear understanding of that. Could you break down what was in that, and is that still there, or is it because of the tepid revenue estimates, since then, has that dissipated?
No, well, it really hasn't dissipated. I mean, I think there was about $900 million over the 3 years. If you went back to, there was a little extra money in May for 13, 14, and 15. It was about $900 overall. We've spent about $300 of it in the current fiscal year, 14, and the governor allocated about $600 million of it in 15. So it hasn't dissipated, because that was unless our estimates are really wrong, which that's what we hope in May, that we at least hold steady, then that $900 million is still there, and it's been pretty much allocated in the current year for transportation, because that was what was in the supplemental that just passed. It was $200 million for roads was the bulk of it, and then in the governor's budget for 15, as I mentioned, he had $100 million roughly for property tax relief, and another $100 million for the budget, $120 million for the budget stabilization fund. Also created a new reserve for the health savings sub-fund, which is basically taking about half of what we think we'll save from the Medicaid expansion and putting it in a fund. So there were these reserves set up that basically takes your surplus, and it's pretty much all allocated. Now in the Senate and House, they may choose to do different things with that $600 million. They may not do the tax relief. They may not put as much into the funds, and they may do more on roads. I mean, those are all. So there's a lot of options.
So the tax relief that you mentioned, is that a little bit of a targeted approach to doing tax relief, as opposed to a very broad or general way of doing it?
And I believe, well, it's definitely targeted to individuals, since it's a homestead property tax, and it's not a whole lot of money, $102 million. I mean, that's a lot of money, but when you spread it over people's homestead property taxes, so it I think was the way it was presented by the governor at the time was they wanted to do something on tax relief, and they wanted to do something for individuals as opposed to business. So,
is it more targeted, would you say, or less targeted than, say, a reduction in the state's income tax rate, which is something that has been also discussed and thought about?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. It's definitely more targeted than that. The income tax would affect, it affects everyone, but it affects, people with lower incomes proportionally, less probably. And sales taxes, of course, are more regressive, and so those would affect people who have lower incomes more. But those, I don't know that you consider either one of those targeted, but they're definitely broader taxes, both of those, than the homestead property tax would be.
So let's switch gears and talk a little bit about transportation, because that's something that I think is on the driving public's mind, and people who are riding in on the roads as well, for sure. And so can you talked a little bit about some money that is in the supplemental for the current year. Could you just kind of give us an overview? I know that the governor called for $1.2 billion last year.
Yeah.
Can you just give us an overview of what's going on in transportation funding?
Sure. Well, and as you know, the governor did call for the 1.2 billion. He this year didn't talk about it at his budget message, but he's still saying he's calling for that. But it's just that in the interim, they're using general fund money, which traditionally, as you know, the transportation budget has been funded with no discretionary state general fund. It's all been either federal revenue or state restricted tax revenue from road taxes. And so the last year was really the first time there has been that much general fund money put into the transportation budget. And for the current year in the supplemental, there was $200 million for road maintenance was part of it, about $100 million, and the other $100 million is for priority road projects. The governor's budget for next year proposed $254 million of general fund money. About 139 of that is to make our federal match. So in other words, if we didn't put that 139 in, because we're not raising enough state restricted tax revenue for roads anymore as we used to be, we're not able to make our full federal match to draw down all the federal money. So somehow you have to put some money in the budget if you want to draw it all down. So the 139 of that 254 is to meet the match. The other 115 is the governor proposed giving it all to the Department of Transportation for state trunk line roads. The Senate reported the bill out, and I can give you the late breaking to the subcommittee anyway, reported out that, and I'm not sure you're on the transportation subcommittee.
I am not, no.
I didn't think so. The governor said it would all go to state trunk line roads. The Senate has proposed that it go to state road and bridge projects, but also to local units, so that local units would have for local roads, which is different than what the governor proposed. The Senate also added $10 million for a rail tunnel between Detroit and Windsor. That was another thing that was kind of something new. I hadn't heard that the bridge gets a lot of discussion, but I hadn't heard much about the tunnel. And there's also $2 million in general fund money for the Regional Transit Authority in Southeast Michigan. So those were new items that were in the Transportation Subcommittee recommendation that was reported out today. And so I'm not sure what support, and I'm not sure what the House will do. Again, they could be reporting their bill out. They may have already, but they may have different priorities for the road funding.
So going to this issue of the general fund dollars, which funds all of the general part of state government, having those dollars supplement the transportation fund, you hear it in the communities saying people concerned about Michigan bringing back our federal transportation dollars. And there's different levels of percentages of how much we bring back to the money that we send out to the federal government, the trust fund, to the federal gas tax. So this isn't to bring back any more money. This is just to bring back
correct
the sort of allotted amount,
yes.
if you will.
Yes, this would just be, and I think we do fairly well on transportation funds from federal revenue, but you're right. This would just give us what we are already allocated. It's not, if we spent more general fund money, we wouldn't get any more federal money for it, because it's just to draw down what we have been allocated. Some of the funds we don't get much of from the federal level is defense funding. That's really one of the reasons Michigan is usually way down on the list when it comes to, if you look at total federal money coming back, it's
But just in terms of transportation, though, if there's a big road project out there, there's a state or local share that has to be provided. So if the general fund, for instance, didn't help support the transportation budget, we could potentially lose out not just on the 139 or however $1 million in transportation projects that would fund, but potentially a significant
Yes.
amount of federal funds that wouldn't be due to us because of that.
correct, because a lot of that flows through the state to the local roads and county roads, and yes, absolutely.
And if we're working on a big state road, interstate or something like that,
Yes. Yeah.
you need to put federal dollars in there as well as state dollars.
Yes.
Okay.
That's kind of how the model has worked, and you're right. And so the fact that we have to, if you were to raise revenue for the roads from a tax of some kind or registration fees, or there've been a lot of proposals out there for that, that could then be used instead of the general fund for the match. I mean, that's what I think has been proposed. If that ever happened, you wouldn't then have to spend the general fund. You could spend the general fund on anything in other budgets.
So now the priority road projects, now that's 115 million you said is in the current year?
Yes.
And that's being proposed for the next year's budget?
Well, I think the House and Senate have different, the Senate's concept for priority roads is to really run the 115 million through what they call PA 51. It's the Transportation Funding Act. And I think it divides it up in thirds between the state projects and then counties, and then I think municipalities. So it's really a three. That's what how the Senate does their priority projects. But I think in the supplemental that we passed in the current year, which was also coincidentally 115 million, those were a list of projects drawn up by legislators that they actually sat down, and there's a master list somewhere that all these different projects that were not run through a formula. They're basically areas where legislators felt the need was. Mm-hmm. And the department, I don't know how supportive the department is about that. The Department of Transportation is about that, but.
Well, I think that way of determining projects and funding transportation draws a lot of questions about how those projects are being determined. And this isn't something for you necessarily to answer, but it sounds like and it seems like it's a political decision-making process, when in fact we probably should be letting the engineers and the people who really know the actual condition of our transportation system make some of those decisions, because if you get the politicians involved too much, you may have questions of favoritism and maybe just not the wisest or the best uses of those limited transportation dollars. But I wanted to thank you, Ms. Jeffries. We're just about out of time for today's show. And thank you for being on the Hopgood Hour and talking about the state budget.
Thank you, Senator. It's a pleasure to be here.
Once again, you have been watching the Hopgood Hour, my monthly public affairs show for the 8th District, and we've been speaking with Ms. Ellen Jeffries, the Director of the Senate Fiscal Agency. We've been talking, of course, about the state budget. I'm State Senator Hoon-Yung Hopgood. As always, please feel free to contact me with any questions or concerns that you may have regarding state government, and please tune in again.